That night, when she knocked on my bedroom door, something inside my carefully maintained world shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. All day there had been a strange tension running beneath the surface of ordinary events, a new kind of energy in the house, soft but charged, like the air before a summer storm. My stepsister's arrival had come as a surprise, a sudden text, a glimpse of her smile through the rain-speckled car window, her suitcase trailing behind her like an afterthought. I greeted her with practiced warmth, showing her the guest room, setting out clean sheets and a folded blanket, trying to suppress the flutter of nerves that ran through me as I caught her watching me with those bright, curious eyes. All evening, the house felt subtly transformed. She moved through my space with an easy, unself-conscious grace, leaving traces of her presence everywhere. A half-finished cup of coffee on the counter, a pair of sneakers by the door, her laughter drifting from the shower as she sang to herself. It unsettled me how quickly I'd grown used to her presence, how her youth and lightness made the house feel less empty, less fixed in its routines. I told myself it was nothing, just the novelty of having company, but there was something more insistent under the surface, a gentle ache that had nothing to do with loneliness. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the windows and filling the house with restless sounds. I lay awake listening, the sheets cool and heavy against my skin, sleep eluding me. My husband was away on a business trip, and the house felt both too large and too intimate at once. When I heard her soft footsteps in the hallway, my heart skipped. I watched the crack of light appear under my door, the faintest pause before she opened it, shivering in a thin robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She said she was cold, her voice barely above a whisper, and for a moment I simply stared at her, frozen by the unspoken invitation. Then, almost on instinct, I pulled back the covers, making space for her beside me. The bed dipped as she slid in, the heat of her body instantly radiating against my side. I tried to stay still, breathing slow and even, but every nerve in my skin was on high alert, hypersensitive to the nearness of her. Her arm brushed mine, and she drew the blanket up to her chin, curling into herself, but I could feel her warmth seeping through the space between us. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, counting each breath, willing myself not to overthink what this meant, but my thoughts swirled, memories of childhood summers, flashes of her laughter, the delicate line of her jaw in the moonlight. The silence between us was almost sacred, heavy with things I could not say. I didn't dare move, afraid to break the fragile spell, but I was aware of every movement she made, every shift in the mattress, the quiet rise and fall of her breath. My mind wandered to places I hadn't let it go in years, questions I'd never dared to ask, desires I'd long buried under duty and routine. I wondered if she could sense my tension, if she noticed how I kept my hands folded tight against my chest, afraid of reaching for her, afraid of myself. Long after she drifted to sleep, I lay awake, my heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm. The darkness felt softer, the boundaries of my life less defined. Something new and dangerous had opened up between us, a secret I hadn't asked for, a possibility that both frightened and thrilled me. For the first time in years, I felt the crack in my own certainty, the tremor of longing waking up somewhere deep inside. I knew nothing had really happened, not yet, but I could feel the shape of it beginning, the edge of something that would change me forever. The days that followed felt as if I were moving through water, every sound muffled, every moment stretched by a quiet anticipation that pulsed beneath my skin. My stepsister settled into my home as though she belonged there, leaving little marks of her presence everywhere, a damp towel in the bathroom, her books stacked on the kitchen table, the gentle traces of her perfume lingering in the hallway long after she'd walked through. She wore my old t-shirts, padding barefoot through the rooms, sometimes humming tunelessly to herself as she prepared coffee or gazed out the window, wrapped in thought. I watched her from a distance, pretending to be absorbed in chores or reading, but my attention kept drifting back to her, drawn by some invisible thread. In the evenings, we gravitated toward each other almost unconsciously. Sometimes she would curl up beside me on the sofa, knees tucked against her chest, a book forgotten in her lap, her hair falling in soft waves across her cheek. I found myself memorizing the curve of her neck, the way her lips parted when she was lost in thought, the subtle flicker of emotion across her face as she read. Her laughter was a melody that seemed to warm every corner of the house, and I began to crave it, searching for ways to make her smile just to hear it again. The ordinary boundaries of our relationship started to blur, replaced by a closeness that felt both innocent and charged with something unspoken. It was late one night when she came to my room again, this time not out of cold, but with a kind of purposeful hesitancy that made my breath catch. She slipped beneath the covers without asking, her skin warm and bare against my own, her arm brushing mine in the darkness. I could feel the tremor in her body, a silent shiver that seemed to pass from her to me. My hands shook as I lay there, acutely aware of every inch of space between us, and the places where there was no space at all. For a while, neither of us moved. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain she could hear it, and when she shifted closer, her breath fluttered against my shoulder. The touch between us started tentatively, a careful brush of her fingers along my arm, the ghost of her knee grazing mine. Her touch was delicate, almost reverent, as if she was searching for permission. I let my hand drift to her back, feeling the tautness of her muscles, the rapid thrum of her pulse just beneath the skin. It was as though we were learning a new language, built on the tiniest movements, the softest gestures. Each touch grew bolder, the boundary between comfort and desire thinning until it barely existed at all. I felt her lips against my temple, the warmth of her exhale tracing the edge of my jaw, and I turned toward her, not daring to open my eyes. In that hush, the world fell away, leaving only the press of our bodies, the mingling of breath and skin. My hands roamed her back, following the subtle ridges of her spine, her hips, the delicate hollow at the base of her neck. Her fingers tangled in my hair, and I surrendered to the trembling in my limbs, letting it pull me closer, letting myself dissolve into the sweetness of her touch. We moved together with hesitant urgency, each caress a question and an answer, every sigh a confession. The tension that had coiled inside me for so long finally unfurled, blooming into something exquisite and terrifying. When we finally stilled, tangled in blankets and heartbeats, I held her close, marveling at how right it felt. There were no words, only the quiet afterglow of connection, the secret drumming quietly beneath the surface of my life. I drifted to sleep with her breath on my shoulder, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between us. The house felt changed, the night softer, the silence electric. In the secret space we had created, I felt both fragile and fearless, the echo of desire trembling through me long after sleep had taken us both. After that night, everything was different, though we pretended nothing had changed. The air between us felt heavier, charged with a silent promise, a shared understanding we carried from room to room like a hidden spark. I caught myself watching her with a new hunger, every movement, every glance, every brush of her fingers as she tucked her hair behind her ear or sipped her morning coffee. It became a private game, this exchange of secret looks, the subtle choreography of wanting and restraint that played out in the gentle chaos of our days. We tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. I filled my time with chores, answered messages from my husband, made small talk with neighbors, but inside I was all nerves and longing, stretched tight between anticipation and fear. Sometimes I woke in the early hours, sheets tangled around my legs, haunted by the ghost of her touch. I replayed our moments in the darkness, her breath on my skin, her lips tracing the line of my collarbone, the way her hands had mapped my body with trembling curiosity and need. I craved the return of those nights, but I was just as afraid of what might happen if we crossed the line too many times, if we could never return. During the day, the boundaries blurred even further. Sometimes she would reach for my hand as we walked through the park, or let her head rest on my shoulder as we sat together reading. Each innocent gesture was laced with memory, a whisper of what happened in the dark. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with a question in her eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. We spoke about everything except the thing that mattered most, choosing silence and soft smiles over words that might shatter the delicate world we'd built. There were nights when she didn't come to my bed, and I would lie awake feeling the absence like a physical ache, missing her warmth, the quiet certainty of her presence beside me. On other nights, she slipped in after midnight, her body slipping beneath the covers, her hands finding mine in the darkness. Our kisses grew slower, deeper, threaded with longing and a growing sense of danger. Every caress became an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the ordinary rules that governed my life before her. We explored each other in the hush of the night, skin to skin, hearts racing, voices lost in the pillows. I memorized the taste of her, the rhythm of her breathing, the way she gasped when I pressed my lips to the sensitive place behind her ear. There was an urgency to our love, but also a profound tenderness, a desire not just to possess, but to cherish. In the mornings, we acted as if nothing had happened, yet everything felt more vivid, more fragile. I found myself afraid of discovery, of the questions I would not be able to answer, of the judgment that would surely follow. Yet even as the weight of secrecy pressed down on me, I could not bring myself to regret what we shared. Her presence made me feel alive in ways I had long forgotten, waking parts of myself I thought had withered away. I became someone I barely recognized, a woman who moved through her days with a secret blooming inside her, a woman both terrified and exhilarated by what she had found. I knew that the path we walked was dangerous, that every step risked everything I had built, but I could not bring myself to stop. In her arms, I found freedom and fear, guilt and longing, and a sweetness that made every risk worth taking. Even as the line between right and wrong blurred into nothing, I was helpless to do anything but follow where my desire led. Time began to lose its shape, stretching and folding until the days melted together into something that felt endless and outside of consequence. My husband's absences became the silent blessing that allowed our private world to grow. The house was no longer just a place of routines and chores, but a sanctuary where we could exist in a way that felt almost mythic, untethered from everything that had come before. Morning light spilled across the floorboards, warming our bare feet as we made coffee and shared silence. She wandered through the kitchen in one of my shirts, her hair tangled from sleep, and each glance between us felt full of secrets, laughter, and the memory of everything we'd done behind closed doors. We spent whole afternoons outside, letting the sun write soft stories across our skin. We walked barefoot in the grass, chased each other through the sprinklers, wove crowns from wildflowers, and pressed them into each other's hair. She coaxed me into swimming in the river, the cold water shocking and delicious, our bodies tangling beneath the current, lips meeting as the world spun overhead. There was a freedom in those moments, a forgetting of age, of names, of obligation. We became only sensation, the bright ache of longing, the giddy abandon of a love that refused to hide when it was just the two of us. She took photos of me in the drowsy afternoons, her laughter coaxing me to loosen up, to pose for her in the filtered golden light. Sometimes she asked me to strip for the camera, and I did, feeling beautiful in ways I never had before, alive in the eyes of someone who wanted nothing more than to look at me. She ran her hands down my body, studied every freckle and scar, traced new lines of desire into my skin. In bed, we grew even bolder, exploring each other with a hunger that surprised and humbled me. I memorized the way her breath caught, the shiver that ran through her when I whispered her name against her shoulder, the sweet arch of her body under my mouth. There was a kind of worship in the way we touched, reverent and desperate all at once, as if by loving each other we could make time stop. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, we lay in tangled sheets, windows thrown open to let in the scent of cut grass and summer rain. She read poetry to me in a low voice, or we simply listened to the cicadas and our own quiet breathing. Even when we said nothing, I felt completely seen, as if every unspoken thought had found its home in her gaze. The outside world receded until it barely seemed real, a distant echo of responsibility and expectation that had nothing to do with the endless now that we inhabited. But underneath all the brightness, a shadow lingered. I caught myself dreading the end, the inevitable return of real life. I tried to push those thoughts away, to live only in the soft present, but sometimes at night, when she fell asleep tangled in my arms, I lay awake listening to her slow breathing, afraid of the clock ticking forward. Each kiss, each whispered promise was tinged with the knowledge that this season could not last forever. Still, I clung to it fiercely, loving her with an intensity that bordered on desperate, determined to hold on to every drop of light before the world crept back in and pulled us apart. Reality intruded slowly, like a chill at the edge of a warm room, at first barely noticeable and easy to ignore. My husband returned sooner than I expected, his key scraping in the lock, the sound foreign and jarring after weeks of softness. The house shrank around us, summer light replaced by shadows and the measured footfalls of routine. I tried to maintain calm, to act as if nothing had changed, but I felt brittle, aware of how my every word, every glance might reveal too much. My stepsister sensed the shift too, her laughter becoming quieter, her footsteps lighter, her gaze sliding away from mine when we passed each other in the hallway. The space between us, once electric and charged with possibility, became filled with a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. She spent more time in her room, texting on her phone, scrolling through endless pages on her laptop, headphones pressed to her ears. I watched her retreat from me, unable to stop her, unable to cross the invisible barrier that had suddenly risen between us. In the evenings, when my husband was home, I played the role of wife, listening to stories about work, helping him unpack, cooking meals, and sitting beside him on the couch, pretending to watch television while my mind wandered back to her. I grew anxious, expecting at any moment for him to notice something amiss, a slip in my tone, a look that lingered too long, a tremor in my hand. The risk of discovery hovered over every gesture, and I became hyper-aware of how our secret colored everything around me. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me, the creak of floorboards as my stepsister moved around in the darkness. Sometimes she did not come to me at all, and I would wake in the pale morning light with the echo of her touch still haunting my skin. Other nights, she slipped into my room after everyone was asleep, and we held each other in the shadowed quiet, our kisses frantic and desperate, edged with fear and longing. I felt her heart racing beneath my palms, tasted the salt of tears that she tried to hide as we pressed our bodies together. We clung to each other, aware that every embrace could be the last, that each touch was balanced on the edge of exposure and ending. The days took on a muted rhythm, each one a little dimmer than the last. She spoke less, her replies clipped and distracted, her eyes distant. I watched her hands shake as she poured coffee, saw the way she flinched when I reached for her in passing. It was as if the world outside had begun to reclaim her, pulling her away from me piece by piece. I wanted to ask her to stay, to beg her to fight for us, but I could not find the words. Fear held me captive, the fear of breaking my family, of losing everything, of being left alone with nothing but regret and memory. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the porch, knees drawn to her chest, face streaked with tears she made no effort to hide. I sat beside her, but she did not look at me, and the silence between us felt bottomless. I reached for her hand, and for a moment she let me hold it, her fingers cold and trembling in my own. I wanted to promise her it would all be all right, that love could somehow survive the constraints of reality, but I could not lie. She pulled her hand away and wiped her face, turning her gaze toward the distant line of trees, and I knew that whatever we'd built that summer was crumbling beneath the weight of what we could not be. The final night together came without warning. She entered my room quietly, her movements hesitant. We made love with a kind of reverence, memorizing each other's bodies in the darkness, lingering over every touch, every sigh. There was no rush, only the ache of goodbye and the desperate hope that this memory would be enough to sustain us in the emptiness to come. Her skin was hot and damp beneath my hands, her lips soft and seeking, her breath shaky against my neck. I tried to hold her tighter, to pull her inside me, to fuse my loneliness with hers. She wept as she touched me, and I tasted the sorrow in her mouth, the confession in her trembling hands. When she finally slipped from my bed and disappeared down the hall, I lay in the darkness, my heart hollow and raw, replaying the night in fragments. In the morning, she was gone. The guest room was empty, the bed stripped, her suitcase vanished. On the nightstand was a single note, folded in half and heavy with meaning. I held it in my hands for a long time before I read it, already knowing what it would say. "Thank you for loving me," it read, and goodbye. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling between my fingers, and let the tears come. The summer was over, the line drawn, and I was left with nothing but the memory of her, bright and aching and already receding into the past. The days after her departure felt weightless, as if I were walking through the world wrapped in gauze, every sensation dulled by the absence of her presence. The house was quieter than it had ever been, the silence so dense it pressed in on me from all sides. Even with my husband home, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, the television murmuring in the living room, there was an emptiness that no sound could fill. I moved through the rooms in a kind of daze, touching objects she had left behind. Her favorite mug in the cupboard, a worn paperback half hidden beneath the couch, a forgotten hair tie curled around a door handle. Each item felt like a secret message, proof that what had happened was real, that I had not simply imagined the days and nights we spent entwined in each other's arms. Routine reasserted itself with relentless insistence. I made the bed every morning, cooked dinner, folded laundry, made small talk at the kitchen counter while pretending to listen to my husband's recounting of meetings and plans and harmless gossip. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting old patterns but unable to return to who I was before she arrived. My body remembered her touch, phantom warmth at my waist, the delicate imprint of her lips at the base of my neck, the way her fingers tangled in my hair in the early light of morning. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and hardly recognize the woman reflected there, eyes rimmed with fatigue, face drawn with longing and grief. At night, sleep became a battlefield. I would lie awake in the darkness, the ceiling painted with shifting shadows, the cool sheets an accusation against my skin. I ached for her in those hours, not just her body, but her laughter, her breathless stories, the way she listened to me as if every word mattered. I tried to remember the sound of her voice, the feel of her hand curled into mine, the wild sweetness of her mouth on my shoulder. Memories came in fragments, sharp and bright, her face tilted up toward the sun as we lay in the grass, the hush of her whisper as she traced poetry along my spine, the last glance she gave me before she disappeared down the hall for the final time. Sometimes, half awake, I would turn over in bed expecting to find her there, only to be met with emptiness. I became obsessed with the traces she had left. I searched for her in the folds of the sheets, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the closet, the imprints her body left in the summer dust on the windowsill. I replayed every moment we had shared, dissecting them for hidden meaning, for signs I had missed. I wondered if I could have fought harder for her, if I had been braver, if I might have convinced her to stay. But the truth was that fear had held me captive, fear of breaking what little security I had, of shattering the life I had spent years building. In the end, love had not been enough to bridge the gulf between desire and reality. My husband never asked about the change in me. Perhaps he sensed it and chose not to speak, or perhaps he had grown too accustomed to silence to notice the difference. I found myself growing resentful of his innocence, of the ease with which he accepted my distant smiles and hollow reassurances. I could not tell him about the world I had discovered and lost, about the ache that lived beneath my ribs, about the part of me that would always belong to her. I started writing letters I never sent, filling page after page with confessions, apologies, memories, and pleas. Sometimes I wrote poetry in the margins of my grocery lists, little scraps of longing that no one would ever read. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, lingering over every candid shot of her laughing, her hair wild and untamed, her eyes bright with mischief. The more time passed, the more I understood that I would never truly forget her, that she had left an indelible mark on me, that no passage of days or return to normalcy could erase. Gradually, the sharpness of my grief dulled into something quieter, a persistent ache rather than a wound. I learned to carry it with me, to let it live alongside the rest of my life. There were mornings when the sun slanted just right across the kitchen floor, and I could almost believe she was there, standing in the doorway with a sleepy smile. On rainy afternoons, I would pause by the window and close my eyes, remembering the feel of her hand in mine, the way she laughed when thunder rolled in the distance. Each season brought its own reminders, the scent of cut grass, the golden haze of late summer, the brittle chill of autumn mornings. All of it belonged to her now, woven into the fabric of my memory. I became braver in small ways. I spoke my mind more often, let myself cry when I needed to, allowed the possibility of desire to linger at the edges of my imagination. I began to see the world not as something to be endured, but as something to be touched and tasted and inhabited fully, even if it meant risking loss and pain. She had shown me what it meant to be awake, to want, to love without apology, even for a little while. Sometimes, late at night, I would whisper her name into the darkness, not expecting an answer, but simply to remember how it felt on my tongue. I wondered where she was, what new city or new love might have claimed her, if she ever thought of me with the same bittersweet longing. I hoped she had found some kind of peace, some new joy to fill the place I had left behind. In the end, I understood that loving her had changed me irrevocably. She had opened a door inside me that could never be closed, revealed a part of myself that would never be hidden away again. Even as I settled back into the rhythms of my life, I carried her with me, not as a regret, but as a secret, fierce blessing. I became a woman who had loved and lost and survived, and in that survival found a different kind of freedom. The memory of her, of us, remained, bright as summer, quiet as the hush after a storm, echoing forever in the spaces where I had learned at last to truly live.